Alfred Becker and his men's contribution to the German war effort is quite astonishing. Officially, they made 42 created vehicles and conversions for the German military to use on the battlefield, but unofficially, it was more, with certain custom prototypes being made and some being cancelled. Now, when you look at the list, obviously, most vehicles have the quite complicated German names, which I will not attempt to pronounce. And some of these vehicles, for instance, the Marder I, are known by different names. Now, this video is to show off around 18 of those vehicles with a bit of detail and some photos to really show you how big that contribution to the German war machine was. Obviously, I'll link my previous video on Alfred Becker and his men. It's quite interesting if you're into like vehicle conversions and logistics. But let's get to it and see some of these creations that he made. And I imagine you will recognise quite a few once you see the pictures of them, as when you look at the list, you think, what the hell are they? But quite a few of them will be well known for the battlefield. So let's jump in. I hope you enjoy. I will note before we begin, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce all the German names because I know people get upset with my poor pronunciation. So the first vehicle is the Marder I. Now this is well known, and it is a Lorraine Schlepper half-track, a French half-track converted with a Pak 40 main gun. Now obviously, when the Germans went into the Soviet Union and Africa, armour started to get a lot heavier. Now this was a really quick conversion, and it was really one of the best conversions overall because it was simple and efficient. And 100 are ordered. Now, the basic stats for this thing are total battle ready weight was 8.5 tons, quite light, so obviously just a half track with a big gun on. Crew was 4, commander, gunner, loader, and driver. It had decent overall speed and propulsion. It was 35 kilometers an hour on the road, 8 off road. Operational range was 120 kilometers on road, 75 kilometers off road. Obviously, primary weapon was the 7.5 centimeter Pak, and the secondary armament was normally an MG34. Now, sometimes these could be put coaxial, it's very rare. A lot of the time they could just be mounted as well, and the crew could detach them to defend it. Every conversion was a little bit different. Even though they tended to have lots of similarities, there were variations. Now, the one disadvantage of this vehicle being open topped, and it was lightly armoured. So the armour was only around 11 millimeters, and the hull was between 6 and 12, depending on which part. And even though it had a very powerful weapon system, it could knock out the T-34s. That's what it was built for. It was a direct response to the T-34 and heavy armoured vehicles. Around 100 were ordered straight away as soon as this kind of vehicle was devised and shown off. But the weather was too much for it in the Soviet Union. Really took an effect on it. And even though it was very powerful, like most early tank destroyers, it could knock out tanks from a distance. But as soon as it had returning fire, it didn't last long. Mortars could take it out, even rifle grenades. It was not built for taking hits, but it was a very successful conversion, and it really did show off Alfred Becker's unit and what they could achieve with a lot less. You know, this was just something quickly knocked together, and it proved to be pretty effective, with some serving up until 1943. After that, there was supposedly a Marder on the books, or a few, until 1945, but these would have been in poor state of operation, and yeah, they wouldn't have been doing much by then. They would have been pretty outclassed by most things, but still, one of the best conversions and one of my favourites, actually. I love a Marder I. Our next vehicle is a 10.5 centimetre Gunwagen Lorraine. Now, these were conversions of the Lorraine Schlepper, and basically a 10.5 centimetre howitzer was placed on them. Now, these served in 1944, with around 24 being built, and they were self-propelled guns. They're actually quite efficient. They served with the Panzer divisions in Normandy, and they were used obviously for indirect fire, but some actually did some direct fire to engage enemy armour. But they eventually met their end in the Falaise Gap pocket, I believe. They were, not many survived. There were only 24 built, so obviously you don't really going to survive long when there's very few numbers. But they were very effective. Total battle weight was 7.7 tons. Crew was 4, commander, driver, gunner, and loader. Propulsion was pretty decent. They could get around 35 kilometers an hour on the road. Off-road, that went down to around between 8 and 12, though these didn't tend to be off-road too much. You'd normally drive them up on the road, pop into a field, fire some rounds off, and then maneuver. It was a self-propelled gun, so maneuverability was its advantage. Its operational range on the road was 137 kilometers, which is pretty good. And its armament was obviously the 105mm LEFH 18 howitzer with 20 rounds stored, but they would normally have a logistics vehicle following by so they could quickly reload these things, because obviously if you're miles away from a supply point, you don't want to be driving back and forth to reload it. Minimises the effect of the vehicle. Now, the armour was weak between 9mm and 12. It wasn't very good at taking fire, and obviously anything bigger than small arms would have torn through it. But they were very effective. They were used quite well with other artillery gun batteries, normally with conjunction with the 15cm version of this vehicle. And yeah, they put out a hell of a lot of firepower. It's a really good, simple conversion. And obviously, Alfred Becker was known for his self-propelled guns. Some of his earlier variants were the first major self-propelled guns that were used by the Germans. So yeah, a very cool vehicle. We do like this one. Our next vehicle is the 15 centimeter gun wagon Lorraine Schlepper. Obviously, this is the bigger brother to the last vehicle, but it did actually come before. So this was actually made in 1942, and they were shown off to Adolf Hitler when he did an inspection of Alfred Becker's unit and their factories. And he was very impressed. So 166 were made in total, and obviously similar to the last vehicle, a self-propelled gun. Now these mainly served in North Africa and in the West, but there are reports that some did get to the Eastern Front. I've not seen any confirmation of that, but it could happen. There were similar 15 centimeter vehicles. Maybe someone got confused, but they're very effective. The total battle ready weight was a bit heavier, 8.5 tons. Crew was 4 again, commander, driver, gunner, and a loader. Propulsion was similar. It was able to get out around 35 kilometers an hour and similar off-road speed between 8 and 12 miles per hour. It did have an operational range of 120 kilometers, so less than its smaller brother. Its armament was a 15 centimeter SFH 13/1 howitzer with 36 rounds, so it could carry more rounds. And it had an MG34 coaxial machine gun. Obviously, this could also be placed on different areas of the vehicle and detached. And its armor between 9 and 12, and the superstructure was between 10 and 14.5, with the sides being 8mm, so it was very light, just like the last vehicle. Now, they served very well. They actually dished out a lot of firepower, and they did have some issues when they were deployed to North Africa. Many were held up, but they did okay there. Obviously, North Africa failed, and they were sent back to the western areas. And in Normandy, they played quite a key role, and the last of them were also destroyed in the Flay's pocket, like its smaller brother there. But they did serve regularly with the 10.5 centimeter gun wagon Lorraine, and obviously far more of them with 166, so they've seen quite a lot more and saw quite a lot of usage. Now, yeah, they were very effective and another really good vehicle, and basically imagine similar to the Grill, but a bit more range, but the fact that they could carry 36 rounds instead of the 24 on the smaller gun, or the 20 actually, is a very big improvement, and it could pump out a lot of firepower. The only things these did have a disadvantage was the logistics vehicles that had to bring the 15 centimeter rounds tended to be quite overloaded. So obviously resupply was quite logistics heavy, but still a very effective self-propelled gun, and I think it's one of the coolest looking ones as well. Apologies, I'm going to have to do some German for this one. So the next vehicle is the 7.5 centimeter Pak 40 Alf Mittler Schützen Panzerwagen S307. Now this was quite a rarer vehicle. It was only 16 made. It was converted from the Soma SCG S307 French half-track. Now, these were originally captured, obviously, during the invasion of France and just used to tow German anti-tank guns after that. They used them to tow various anti-tank guns and artillery pieces and for logistics support. But an effort to make more mobile anti-tank guns was being pushed. So these were produced in 1943. Now, only 16 were produced, but they were pretty effective. Obviously, armed with the Pak 40, they could take out most medium tanks and even some heavy. The armament, obviously, 7.5 centimeter Pak 40 L46. Its engine was pretty strong. It could achieve 36 miles per hour on the road. No, kilometers an hour, should I say, on the road, with around 12 to 14 off-road. Being a half-track, it could deal with some terrain, but not too much. We don't have much info on its operational history. I do imagine they served more in the West, but there was only 16, so it was quite a limited run. But they were fairly effective. The only disadvantage of being on a half-track, obviously, you're quite a large target, and they're quite under-armoured. Its armour was only around 8 to 12 millimeters, depending on which part. So it couldn't stand up to many things. Anti-tank rifles would penetrate it. It was only there to take small arms. But quite an interesting vehicle. But one of those kind of one of Alfred Becker's conversions where they just made a small run of them with whatever was available, and then they're kind of forgotten about. So a bit of a rare one there, but still quite interesting. Our next vehicle is the 10.5 centimeter gun wagon Hotchkiss. So basically this was the 39H, which was converted from Hotchkiss. Very similar to our second vehicle we introduced, which was the Lorraine Schlepper version with the 10.5, but this was just simply from a Hotchkiss chassis. Now 48 were produced, and they were made around 1942. Now battle ready weight was 13 tons. Crew was 5, commander, driver, gunner, and 2 loaders. And it had pretty good engine. It was able to get out 36 kilometers an hour on the road and around 12 to 16 off-road. Now, operational range was 180 kilometers, so it was quite good. Its armament, obviously 105mm LEFH 18 howitzer with 36 rounds, so better armament than its smaller brother there. And its secondary was an MG34 machine gun. Now, the armour was a bit better, so the hull armour was between 22 and 34mm, with the side being 34mm and the rear 34mm, but I think that varies around where it was. It could be as low as between 10 and 12, I believe. But the fact that it was built on a Hotchkiss tank chassis was a very big upgrade of the previous half-tracks, because obviously you could take more hits. Now, obviously, if you were being fired at, this thing wasn't doing its job because it was a self-propelled gun, but they were pretty effective. Now, it's said that they served with the 21st Panzer Division with Schwerabteilung 200, which was Alfred Becker's own unit, which he actually led into battle in 1944. So these saw some pretty fierce action once the Allies obviously landed in Normandy and pushed further towards Germany. But they were pretty good, and actually in that time, they were used not only for artillery, but they did in some situations hide in forests and ambush tanks. There was a particular situation where they ambushed a few Shermans, and obviously the direct fire from even the high explosive shells alone was enough to crack a Sherman apart. But they could also be loaded with heat shells as well, so were very effective at anti-tank if you were brave enough to, hold your nerve and fire the round off. So a nice unit, and they're very cool looking. I do like the Hotchkiss chassis. Quite different to see that. So yeah, really cool creation there. Number 5 is definitely a winner. The next vehicle, or should I say vehicles in the series, are Becker's Lorraine APCs and kind of logistic support vehicles. Now, obviously, tons of these were captured from the French, and they were used for lots of different things, but not just firing. Also, they were used as armoured personnel carriers, artillery spotters, munitions carriers, ambulances, and even specialist command vehicles with the advanced radios. Now, they tended to weigh around 6 tons. There was normally 2 crew, a commander and driver. Obviously, this went up for certain logistics vehicles, and obviously the ambulance vehicle might have had a crew of 4 with like 2 medics in. The engine would give it around 35 kilometers an hour on the road and around between 12 and 16 off-road. The range was around 137 kilometers, which was pretty good. Had no armament, most of these. They were basically unarmored. They were there to support or transport. Its armor was between 5 and 9 millimeters, though they did up armor some of the command vehicle variants quite a bit. There's not an official kind of record, but some say between 20 and 30 millimeters. For an observation vehicle for a command unit, that'd be quite useful. And the production was around 630 if you include all the types. Now, we can't tell if that also includes some of the artillery conversions on the Lorraine chassis, but I imagine this is just for the APCs and logistics vehicles. But it does show how much you can do with captured vehicles. And to be fair, the French's armory was used to great usage by the Germans, but especially though just in this logistics element. And for artillery spotting, people don't tend to respect those vehicles, but remember, there were no drones, there were no satellites. It was very important to have someone out there spotting and zeroing your artillery. So you just can't imagine how useful these things were, especially on the Eastern and Western fronts, and the Eastern front where the war was probably the most brutal. Our next vehicle will be a favourite of many of you. It is basically the Hotchkiss H35 tank with the 4 30cm Wolfram rockets attached, the Wolfram 40s. Now, many vehicles were used to fire these. Obviously, you'll know about the walking Stuka, and they could also be fired from a static frame. But Alfred Becker's unit specifically made the Hotchkiss converted it to fire these. Now, it was obviously useful because you could quickly pop in, fire, and retreat. And these rockets had a range of around 4.5 kilometers, which is about 2.7 miles. So not a massive range, but thanks to the Hotchkiss's chassis, and obviously had a 37mm main gun and a secondary machine gun, and it did provide them with a little bit of armor and decent speed going around 28 kilometers an hour on the road when loaded with these. They could pop in, fire the rockets off at the target, and they were 4 at once. And obviously, if you had 2 or 3 vehicles, you could fire it in a salvo of 12. And what many people don't know about these rockets, in the cages, the wooden cages on the side, that's how they come. They were placed in that, so you could get back to your supply point, detach the cages, and put new ones on quite quickly. It took about 5 to 10 minutes to reload a cage, get it off and bolt, screw or bolt a new one on, and then back into the battlefield and launch again. So you had a very effective multiple launch rocket system. And the fact is, they had quite a lot of these rockets, but not enough things to launch them. So they started to literally use whatever they could to launch these. And obviously, Alfred Becker made these really cool Hotchkiss launchers. And I really like these. Obviously, they're very effective if you use them in many games. And obviously, it'd be nice to see some of these used in TV series or movies, because obviously a lot of Hotchkiss tanks still out there. It'd be quite easy to do that. But yeah, a very cool little conversion. I think many of you will know it already, but it's one of my favorites. Actually, a lot of them are my favorites, but this one definitely my favorite for levels of destruction that you could deploy. Our next vehicles are going to be coming as a pair. These are some anti-aircraft vehicles made by Alfred Becker and his unit. We have the 2cm Flak 36 standard and the 2cm Flak Failing 36 built on the Uni P107. Now, this was a French vehicle built by Citroën, and they were made in 1934. Actually, some even got exported to Poland and then exported, recalled back when the war started. That was a pretty good little half track, more of like a logistics half track and transport. It could carry around 5,000 kilos loaded, so obviously it could easily carry the standard 2cm flak gun and the flak veiling, and it was capable of 45 kilometers an hour on the road now. They made around 82 of the standard single 2cm barreled flak variants and 18 of the flak veiling variants. These were obviously pretty good against close air support, but Allied air support tended to target obviously larger armoured formations and static positions, because the threat of Allied air attack was more of a morale thing as well. Like, I think it was less than 1% of German kind of casualties on the ground was by air support. So most of the times these vehicles were supporting the ground units and being used to obviously hit infantry-like vehicles, but also really good for suppressing targets. If you ever read Tigers in the Mud, he talks about how he had multiple anti-aircraft vehicles that basically would just fire as much ammunition as possible at the enemy once they were doing an assault to suppress, anti-tank gun positions and machine gun positions. So a really good supporting unit, and yeah, fantastic conversion by Alfred Becker, especially the flak veiling variant for 2cm autocannons is absolutely lethal, and obviously looks really cool as well. So really cool little conversions there. The next series of vehicles we're discussing is the Raketenwerfer and the Rehemwerfer. I actually did a video on these, so we'll link that below for the full details. But basically, these were quick-made multiple launch rocket and mortar systems. Now, they were tended to be made on the Somme MCL half-track, the French half-track, and they were everything ranged from light rockets to mortars, where one of the most standard ones was basically 20 81mm mortars. These are French mortars that they captured large amounts of the mortars and the rounds, and they basically would get them on the back in the stacks of either 5 or 10, and they used drop-down strings to launch these mortars. Now, they were fantastic. They served on the eastern and western fronts, and basically they were mainly used for attacks and retreats, basically for suppression, because 20 mortar shells is, it's a lot of firepower, but more for, hitting light positions, but also lots of them hitting at once would cause the enemy to, get down, take cover. So they were fantastic for, quick assaults, but also covering withdrawals on the Eastern Front at this point. By the time they were deployed, I believe it was 43 onwards, things weren't going so well on the Eastern Front. So really cool little conversions. There were lots of variations of these, and each one was a bit different, but it was a really good use of large amounts of captured French mortars and ammunition, because they captured a lot of it, but obviously the Germans already had their own 81mm mortar, so good use of captured stuff, good reusing and recycling, and one of my favourite vehicles. So definitely go watch the Rehemwerfer video. It's a nice little video, and it obviously explains it in further detail. And last but not least, we have the variants of the Uni P107s that were converted. Obviously, we covered some of the anti-aircraft variants, but these are some of the other variants. So some were turned into 8cm mortar carriers, some were turned into Pak 36 anti-tank gun carriers, which was the 3.7cm anti-tank gun. Now, these also served as logistic vehicles and munitions carriers. They made good use of this because there was a lot of P107s captured. And yeah, just like the Lorraine, this was another French vehicle that they basically used for everything they could, because there were large amounts captured and large amounts of spare parts. And I do believe, even though the factories were taken over, they were still running some of them. I think some of the factories were still in limited production, so it was able to actually get fresh parts and fresh, bits that were needed to keep them running. So they did really well, and these served in basically all over the fronts, wherever they were needed, and obviously until they broke down and they were destroyed. And basically the video, bit of just an overview of some of the vehicles Alfred Becker and his team created. I just wanted to go through it because I don't think people realise how much he created. And this is not the full list. Obviously, there's 42 officially. I think altogether it's over 3,000 pieces or vehicles were converted and created. It was a hell of a lot. And I think people say, oh, well, how much did they actually affect the war? Well, imagine one guy plus 1,800 men, I believe it was, converting and creating 3,000 vehicles from captured equipment. The amount of savings for German industry that we're able to focus on other projects, obviously normally wasteful projects like the Jagdtiger, but still a massive contribution to the war effort. And once again, shows Alfred Becker's ingenuity and efficiency. So yeah, thanks for watching this one. A bit of a ramble. I just want to do something a bit different. And obviously I'll link those two videos that I've mentioned, Alfred Becker one and the Rehemwerfer. And I will go through some of these vehicles in more detail in the future. I'm thinking about doing some of the self-propelled guns and their effect on the war. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone, and you guys have a fantastic evening.